Britain entered the First World War with confidence, not fear. It did not expect collapse. It did not expect exhaustion. What it did not expect was to survive a war that would quietly take away everything that once made survival feel effortless. This is not a story about defeat. Britain did not lose the First World War. It endured. It held together. It was still standing when the fighting stopped. But survival is not the same as recovery, and this war ensured that the Britain which entered in 1914 would never fully return. In the summer of that year, Britain did not prepare for a national endurance test. The conflict was expected to be limited, manageable, and ultimately resolvable. Britain had intervened in European wars before. They were costly but contained. This one was framed as another corrective intervention, firm, necessary, and temporary. Britain was not a desperate power. Its navy dominated the seas. Its economy was stable. Its empire provided depth and resources. Entering the war was presented as obligation rather than survival, as balance rather than gamble. Few believed that the war would demand total national commitment, let alone reshape the country itself. Public mood reflected that confidence, mobilization carried optimism, not dread. The language of the time focused on momentum and movement, not exhaustion or attrition. The army that crossed into Europe was professional and disciplined, trained for maneuver and decision, not for waiting, stagnation, and prolonged strain. What Britain misjudged was not courage or capability, but the nature of the conflict it had entered. This war did not reward speed or decisiveness. It resisted resolution. Early battles failed to settle the front. Lines hardened instead of breaking. Each attempt to force progress only deepened the stalemate, pulling Britain further into a conflict that refused to end on familiar terms. There was no single moment of realization, no announcement that the war would last years. Understanding arrived gradually, through repetition rather than shock. Temporary measures became permanent systems. Casualty lists grew longer, quietly and consistently. What had begun as a limited commitment expanded into a continuous demand on manpower, industry, and national attention. By the end of the first year, Britain was still intact. Its armies had not collapsed. Its homeland was untouched. From the outside, the country appeared resilient. Yet beneath that stability, something fundamental had already shifted. Britain was no longer fighting to end the war quickly. It was fighting to justify remaining in it. The conflict Britain entered expecting resolution was becoming a test of endurance, one it would survive but never fully recover from. As the war dragged beyond its expected limits, Britain began doing what it had always done best, organizing. What could not be solved quickly would be managed systematically. Industry was redirected. Supply chains formalized, and the language of war shifted from action to process. The conflict was no longer something to be won swiftly. It was something to be sustained. Factories that once served civilian markets were absorbed into military production. Railways became arteries of war. Shipyards worked relentlessly, not to project power, but to replace losses. The scale was unprecedented. This was not the mobilization of an army alone, but of an entire society. The war demanded shells, coal, steel, food, uniforms, millions of items delivered continuously, without pause. Britain's strength was no longer measured by decisive blows, but by throughput. Manpower followed the same logic. The early reliance on professional soldiers and volunteers soon proved insufficient. Casualties were not catastrophic in isolation, but cumulative. Each offensive consumed men faster than they could be replaced by enthusiasm alone. Conscription, once unthinkable, became inevitable. The war machine did not ask whether individuals wished to participate. It required that they do. What emerged was a grinding rhythm. Prepare, attack, absorb losses, reorganize, repeat. Success was measured less by territorial gain and more by whether the system continued to function. Could the army still field divisions? Could industry meet demand? Could morale be maintained long enough to endure another year? These questions replaced earlier hopes of decisive victory. Britain adapted efficiently, but adaptation came with cost. The state expanded its reach into daily life. Rationing appeared gradually, then firmly. Labor disputes were suppressed in the name of necessity. Civil liberties bent under pressure. None of this happened dramatically. It happened administratively. Forms replaced speeches. Committees replaced debate. The machine did not roar. It hummed. The war also altered how time was perceived. There was no clear sense of progress. Each year was framed as preparation for the next. Sacrifice was justified by future outcomes that never quite arrived. The language of endurance became normalized. Losses were absorbed statistically. Entire battles were reduced to production figures and casualty ratios. Survival became procedural. Importantly, the machine did not fail. Britain did not collapse under the strain. Supplies continued to flow. The navy held the seas. The economy bent but did not break. From the outside, the system appeared resilient. From within, it was exhausting. The war demanded constant output without offering closure. There was no end in sight, only continuation. By the middle years of the conflict, Britain was no longer fighting in hopes of resolution. It was fighting to justify everything already spent. Lives, resources, and political capital had been invested too deeply to withdraw. The machine had momentum of its own. To stop would mean admitting that the sacrifice had been without meaning, and so it moved forward, not with confidence, but with obligation. The war was no longer driven by ambition, but by the necessity of keeping the machine running. By the time Britain adjusted fully to the scale of the war, the purpose of fighting had subtly changed. The language of victory still existed, but it no longer guided decisions. What mattered now was continuity. The line had to hold, not advance decisively, not collapse, simply hold. Trench warfare imposed this logic with brutal clarity. Once the front line stabilized, movement became dangerous and rare. Every attempt to break the stalemate required enormous preparation and delivered limited results. Artillery barrages reshaped landscapes, but failed to resolve the conflict. Gains were measured in yards, not outcomes. Losses, meanwhile, were measured in tens of thousands. Britain learned that survival on the Western Front was not about brilliance, but persistence. This environment transformed the psychology of command. Strategy became conservative by necessity. Risk was no longer a tool, it was a liability. Commanders were judged not by victories, but by whether their sectors remained intact. A failed offensive could be disastrous, but a quiet month, no breakthroughs, no disasters, was considered success. Stability became the highest achievement. For the soldiers, this shift was deeply corrosive. War was no longer episodic, it was continuous. The front did not pause. There were no clean beginnings or endings, only rotations in and out of the same mud, the same shellfire, the same uncertainty. Survival depended on routines, digging, repairing, waiting. The enemy was ever present, but rarely visible. Death arrived randomly, without drama or warning. Morale did not collapse, but it thinned. Endurance replaced motivation. Men fought less for cause than for cohesion. Loyalty to the unit, the man beside them, the habit of duty. Courage became quieter. Heroism, when it appeared, was often unnoticed. The war rewarded those who could endure boredom and terror simultaneously. At home, the reality of holding the line filtered through slowly. Casualty lists lengthened. Familiar names disappeared from communities. The war was no longer distant or abstract. It reached into households and routines, altering expectations about loss and normalcy. Still, the national posture remained composed. Britain did not dramatize its suffering, it absorbed it. This restraint was itself a form of discipline. Panic would have been dangerous. Doubt could fracture the effort. The state and the press maintained a careful balance, acknowledging hardship without questioning purpose. The goal was not to inspire excitement, but to prevent despair. By this stage, the war's meaning had narrowed. Britain was no longer fighting to reshape Europe. It was fighting to avoid collapse. To withdraw would unravel years of sacrifice. To fail would retroactively nullify everything already endured. The line, therefore, had to be held, not because it promised victory, but because it represented continuity itself. And continuity, under these conditions, became indistinguishable from survival. The war had reached a point where not losing mattered more than winning. As the war continued without resolution, the pressure extended far beyond the front lines. Britain's strength had always rested on its empire, its global reach, resources, and manpower. In the early years of the conflict, this appeared to be an advantage. Troops arrived from across the dominions. Raw materials flowed inward. The empire gave Britain depth. But depth came with obligations, and over time, those obligations began to strain the structure that held everything together. The war demanded more than Britain alone could supply. Colonial forces were drawn into a conflict that was not theirs in origin, yet unavoidable in consequence. Men from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean were mobilized to sustain a war fought largely in Europe. Their participation was framed as loyalty, but it was driven by necessity. The empire was being asked not to contribute, but to compensate for losses, shortages, and exhaustion at the center. Economically, the pressure was relentless. Britain's financial reserves drained steadily. Imports increased as domestic production struggled to meet military demand. Loans replaced surpluses. By the middle years of the war, Britain was no longer funding the conflict from strength, it was borrowing to survive it. This shift marked a quiet but profound change. The empire that once financed global influence was now mortgaging its future to sustain the present. At home, the war widened existing fractures. Class divisions sharpened under strain. Industrial labor became essential, but unrest grew as working conditions tightened and wages lagged behind inflation. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, not as a social experiment, but as an emergency measure. These changes were practical, but irreversible. The war altered the internal balance of British society in ways that would not easily be undone. Politically, authority became more centralized. Emergency powers expanded. Decision-making narrowed. The war demanded efficiency, not debate. This concentration of control kept the system functioning, but it also distanced leadership from the population it governed. Trust was maintained, but it was no longer effortless. The social contract was being renegotiated under pressure. Across the empire, the strain was felt unevenly but deeply. Participation in the war raised expectations of recognition, autonomy, and reform. These expectations were rarely met. The contradiction grew sharper, an empire asking for sacrifice while postponing change. The war did not create these tensions, but it accelerated them. What had once been manageable began to feel unstable. Despite this, the structure held. Britain did not lose control. The empire continued to supply men and material. On the surface, the system functioned. But function should not be mistaken for health. The war extracted energy without replenishment. Every year of survival weakened the foundations slightly more. By the later stages of the conflict, Britain was still standing, but it was doing so by distributing strain outward and downward. The cost of endurance was being deferred, not avoided. The empire was carrying Britain through the war, even as the war quietly reshaped and weakened the empire in return. Survival had been achieved, but the weight of it was no longer evenly borne. When the war finally ended, Britain stood among the victors. The armistice confirmed what endurance had preserved. The country had not collapsed, its armies had held, and its enemies had been forced to stop. On paper, this was success. Yet the reality beneath that outcome was far less reassuring. Britain emerged from the war intact, but profoundly diminished. The victory did not restore what had been spent. Financially, the war had drained the nation's reserves and reversed its position as the world's leading creditor. Britain owed more than it was owed. The costs of maintaining the war machine, borrowing, importing, subsidizing, had reshaped the economy around debt. This was not a temporary imbalance. It marked a permanent shift in global influence. Britain remained powerful, but it was no longer dominant in the way it had been before 1914. Socially, the war had altered expectations in ways that could not be contained. Millions of men returned, changed, or did not return at all. Communities carried gaps that would never close. The scale of loss was not dramatic in any single moment. It was cumulative and persistent. Entire age groups were thinned. The absence became part of everyday life. Victory did not erase that absence. It confirmed it. Politically, the war resolved very little. The peace that followed was fragile and contested. Britain had helped end the conflict, but it had not shaped a stable future. The effort expended during the war left limited capacity for reconstruction afterward. Energy had been consumed in survival, leaving little for renewal. The nation had reached the end of its endurance, not the beginning of recovery. There was also a deeper psychological cost. The belief in steady progress, central to Britain's pre-war confidence, had been shaken. The war demonstrated that industrial power could sustain destruction indefinitely without delivering clarity or closure. The idea that stability was permanent no longer held. The country had learned how fragile order could be, and that knowledge lingered. Importantly, Britain did not dramatize this outcome. There was no national collapse, no overt reckoning. Life resumed. Institutions continued. The appearance of continuity remained. But beneath that surface, the war had altered the relationship between effort and reward. Sacrifice had been total. Recovery was partial. The war's end did not bring relief so much as release. The pressure lifted, but the damage remained. Britain had endured the strain longer than many, but endurance itself had become the defining achievement. Victory, once imagined as resolution, had been reduced to survival, with consequences deferred. By surviving the war, Britain preserved its position, but at the cost of its previous certainty. The nation moved forward, not strengthened by triumph, but shaped by what it had barely managed to withstand. The war had been won, but the country that won it was no longer whole. The end of fighting did not mark the end of consequences. For Britain, the war's true cost extended far beyond the armistice. What had been deferred during the conflict, social strain, financial imbalance, political uncertainty, now surfaced in quieter but more persistent forms. The nation returned to peace, carrying burdens it had neither planned for nor fully understood. Economically, the post-war years were defined by adjustment rather than renewal. Debt-constrained policy. Industrial production struggled to transition away from wartime demand. Unemployment rose as factories closed or downsized. The systems that had been built to sustain war were ill-suited to sustain peace. Britain did not collapse, but it stalled. Growth was uneven. Confidence was restrained. The sense of effortless leadership that had characterized the pre-war era was gone. The human cost was equally enduring. The war had removed a generation not only from the battlefield, but from the future. Skilled labor, leadership, and experience were missing in ways that statistics could not capture. Families adapted to loss that never fully receded. Memory became part of daily life, not through spectacle, but through absence. Cemeteries expanded quietly. Commemorations became routine. Grief settled into the national fabric. Politically, the war destabilized assumptions about order. The old balance between class, labor, and authority no longer held. Demands for reform intensified, not because the war promised change, but because it exposed inequality. Those who had endured the strain expected acknowledgement. The state responded selectively, cautiously, often reluctantly. The result was not resolution, but tension managed rather than resolved. Across the empire, the aftershocks were even more pronounced. Participation in the war had raised expectations of autonomy and recognition. When these expectations were delayed or denied, resentment followed. Britain retained control, but its authority was increasingly questioned. The war had required cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Peace did not sustain it. The contradiction became clearer. An empire built on endurance could not indefinitely endure its own contradictions. Perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. Britain emerged from the war more cautious, more defensive, and less certain of its place in the world. The war had demonstrated that survival could be achieved without progress, and that endurance did not guarantee stability. This understanding shaped decisions long after the fighting stopped. Risk was avoided. Commitments were measured carefully. The memory of strain lingered. By the 1920s, Britain was still standing, still influential, still coherent, but it was operating under constraints it had not faced before. The war had not destroyed the nation. It had narrowed its options. Every choice was weighed against what had already been lost, and what could not be recovered. The conflict had ended in 1918. Its effects did not. The war no longer demanded sacrifice, but it continued to collect payment. Britain emerged from the First World War intact, but altered in ways that were difficult to summarize and easy to overlook. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic end that marked a clear before and after. Instead, the change was gradual and cumulative. The country continued to function, its institutions remained, its flag still flew. Yet the assumptions that had once underpinned its confidence were gone. Before the war, Britain's power had felt stable and self-sustaining. After it, power required careful maintenance. Every decision carried the memory of strain. Every commitment was weighed against the risk of repeating what had already been endured. The war had taught Britain that survival was possible, but also that it was expensive, exhausting, and not endlessly repeatable. This realization reshaped national behavior. Caution replaced certainty. Influence was exercised more selectively. The empire still existed, but it was no longer unquestioned. Authority depended increasingly on negotiation rather than inevitability. Britain had survived the war, but it had lost the sense that survival alone guaranteed continuity. The phrase, "still standing," captured this condition precisely. It implied resilience, but also fatigue. The nation had absorbed the shock without falling, yet it leaned on structures that had been weakened in the process. What had once felt permanent now required constant reinforcement. Stability became an effort rather than an expectation. The war also left a lasting imprint on memory. Commemoration became institutionalized, not celebratory. Monuments did not mark triumph so much as endurance. Silence replaced rhetoric. The cost of the war was not framed as a lesson mastered, but as a reality acknowledged. Britain remembered the conflict not through victory narratives, but through restraint. In this way, the war defined a boundary. It marked the end of an era in which Britain could act with confidence, born of surplus, of manpower, of capital, of certainty. After 1908, those surpluses no longer existed. Choices became constrained. Influence became conditional. The nation adapted, but it did so within narrower margins. Importantly, Britain did not disappear. It did not fall into irrelevance. it continued to play a major role in global affairs. But its trajectory had changed. The First World War did not destroy Britain. It recalibrated it. The country moved forward, carrying the knowledge of what total strain looked like and what it had cost to survive it. That is why the war matters beyond its battles. It was not the conflict Britain lost, it was the conflict Britain endured and was permanently shaped by in the process. Survival preserved the state, but it transformed the nation. Britain was still standing, but it was standing on different ground than before.